Pokemon is a great game, but whether you've played it 10 times, 100 times, or even 1,000 times, using the same canon mons will eventually start to feel boring. So in this video, I'll be showcasing 10 fan-made games that I believe are the best that feature new Pokemon. But with the number of Fakemon games that end up getting abandoned, I decided to add a rule to the list, that I'll only be showing games that are either completed or have had a content update in the last few years. So without further ado, let's jump right into the games. Starting at number 10 is a completed fan game called Pokemon Jade, and let me start by saying that its completed state is probably the only thing keeping it on this list, but I'll try to be optimistic, and start with the good. It takes place in the brand new region of Ario, inspired by the real-world continent of Australia. You'll play as a Pokemon trainer who just received their starter, ready to begin their journey and collect 8 gym badges across the region. The maps do look pretty good, as they're put together with an unofficial tile set, and they didn't feel like a chore to progress through, although the story was kind of lackluster. It felt like it had potential, but ultimately fell flat due to the quality of the writing. However, where the game starts to really fall apart is, unfortunately, the Fakemon designs. They just don't look that great. Some of them look pretty okay, but for the most part, you'll have a hard time building a team of Pokemon that look cool, especially when the game features only unofficial ones. They also lack cries, and while they feel alright to use in battle, the bland music choices don't really elevate the experience in any way. But reading the comments on the Poke community thread, it looks like some people enjoyed it where I didn't. So if the Fakemon designs don't bother you, then I suppose it wouldn't hurt to give it a try. But remember, this is a top 10, so the first one I talk about is obviously going to be the worst. However, I promise that the other 9 games have a lot more to offer in terms of Fakemon design, graphical appeal, and story quality. So let's take a look at Pokemon Impetu, or the English translation, Pokemon Momentum. The story begins in a small and faraway town, just having completed your exams required to become a Pokemon trainer. You'll bid your farewells and quickly board a train headed to the new region. From there, the plot is pretty basic. You'll be handed a starter alongside a Pokedex and some Pokeballs, with the goal being to travel across the region and to challenge the 8 gyms. You'll meet characters with pretty generic goals, but are at least expressed with hand-drawn art to introduce them. But where the plot failed to interest me, I had a bit more fun exploring the region. Routes feel very populated with people and Pokemon, and despite its lack of linearity, I never found myself frustrated or confused about where to go next. Visually, however, there wasn't anything about the region that stood out to me. Like, it definitely doesn't look bad, but it doesn't have anything that I felt defined it in a way that separated it from other official and fan-made regions. But what you of course want to hear about are the new Pokemon, and how they feel to battle with and against. There are currently over 60 Fakemon to capture, and even a few regional forms. Graphically, most of them look pretty messy. There were a few nice looking ones, but for the most part, they kind of failed to impress. Especially the later forms, as I found myself in a few situations where a Fakemon I liked the design of evolved into something I had to try really hard not to abandon. But the gameplay definitely made up for it, as they all felt good to use, and none of the ones I chose for my team felt useless. They are also spread throughout the region very well. The devs didn't hold back with the variety, and let you capture a bunch of different typed Pokemon before you even reach the first gym leader. To top it all off, the game is no short of quality of life. From the start, you'll have access to the EXP All, an item that lets you heal your full team, that you can recharge for free at any Pokemon Center, and the ability to fast travel across the region at any point. Overall, I think Pokemon Momentum is a pretty good game that just lacks a bit of polish, but definitely not in a way that'll limit your fun. Its current version goes up to the 5th gym, so keep that in mind if you choose to play it. Alright, so you can't make this kind of video without talking about Pokemon Uranium, the insanely popular fan game with a brand new region, story, and over 100 Fakemon. That was even one of the few projects to ever face legal trouble from Nintendo. But obviously, with its popularity, my normal method of showcasing wouldn't really work or matter. So instead, I'll be talking about whether or not it's worth playing in 2025. Pokemon Uranium takes place in the new region of Tandor, that's split into two different segments, one more land-based and the other sea. The region is very pretty and very fun to explore, with its beautiful soundtracks and incredible ambiance. I really liked how unique a lot of the towns looked, as it made you feel like you were actually traveling to the opposite ends of a new world. The story, though, it was alright. It has a pretty unique intro segment, and a climax that has some very interesting moments. But everything in between is pretty standard to the Game Freak formula. The best part of the game, though, is obviously the new Pokemon. Visually, they're all very well designed, and a few of them even have animated sprites. But Pokemon Uranium has one very big flaw, and that's its horrendous balance. To start, the level curve is really bad. Pokemon felt like they were getting barely any EXP from battle, even when I was fighting opponents at the same level or often higher than my own, which was actually more often than not, because once I got past the first gym, every trainer had Pokemon that were 3 to 4 levels above my team members. And you might think that makes the game a bit more of a fun challenge, but it definitely didn't feel that way, when my Pokemon were doing very little damage and taking a lot in return. And that's mostly thanks to the fact that a lot of Pokemon take a while to learn any useful moves. Like this little frog guy, for example, doesn't get a water type move until level 17, which might not sound that bad once you actually get there, but you're going to be spending 80% of the early game switch training. But alright, this game came out in 2016. It was already way ahead of its time in so many other ways, so little flaws like this can be expected, right? Correct. But there's one misconception. Although the original development team was forced to abandon the game, a new one did come in shortly after, and has continued to fix bugs, provide mystery gifts, and even release a short post-game update 8 years after the game's originally completed release. Yet, even with their existence, the level curve feels just as bad as it did when I first played the game in 2017. So I think Uranium can definitely be enjoyed in 2025, especially with its beautiful world and amazing Fakemon designs. It just kind of sucks that it's plagued with tons of bad game design choices that almost feel intentional at this point. But up next is a project pretty similar, with a new story and region, that I found to be a lot more enjoyable than the last three. At number 7 on this list is Pokemon Perseda, a gorgeous fan game with over 100 new Pokemon. Starting with the story, it'll open with a cutscene that introduces you to the world. After that, you'll attend a festival that's quickly interrupted by a comet that crashed nearby, and upon investigating, you'll find the Pokemon Professor under attack. You'll pick a starter to defend them, and the next day, you'll be tasked with exploring the region to investigate a strange phenomenon called star signs. The plot takes place in the Constella region, a kingdom that's been peaceful and prosperous for centuries thanks to its advances in technology and magic. It's a very beautiful region that's incredibly well mapped, with each town feeling like it has its own personality, and that's mostly thanks to the game's amazing soundtrack. So the world is very pretty, and the story is packed with tons of lore and entertaining characters. But do the Fakemon disappoint? Not at all. They're all very charming, and you can catch a ton of them very early. Plus, alongside completely original new Pokemon, you'll also have new evolutions to official ones and new regional forms. However, the fun still doesn't end there, as Perseda has 2 new gimmicks that'll be present during the entire game. The first one is star signs. Every Pokemon will have a chance to possess one of 6 signs, which essentially function as a second ability. The second gimmick is mana. It's a resource that can be used to interact with the world, such as opening a magically sealed chest or activating a monument that heals your team. I don't want to spoil the gimmicks in their entirety, as I found it more fun to explore them blindly, but you can find a guide on how they work on the game's website. Finally, if it couldn't get any better, you get access to quality of life, such as the EXP all, and a Pokedex that shows you all the stats, learnable moves, and evolution levels of every Pokemon. But if you're wondering why this game isn't further down the list, it's because of its translation. The game is about half in Spanish and half machine translated to English, so playing normally you might have a hard time understanding the plot, but there is a setting that copies on-screen text to your clipboard, so you can use apps like VN Translator to properly understand everything. But even with that flaw, the game is still incredibly fun, with a lot of content currently available. And once it's completed, I seriously believe it will be one of the best Pokemon fan games ever made. Coming in at number 6 is a fan game that's admittedly a bit old, but still holds up pretty well. This is Pokemon Solar Light and Lunar Dark, a fan game with over 350 new Pokemon. The story takes place in the mostly tropical region of Rikoto, where you'll play as a new trainer on a journey to collect 8 gym badges. The region is pretty nice looking. It resembles the art style of the 5th generation, but I felt that it was a lot more colorful and had a lot less gray areas than most of the official games. But on your journey through Rikoto, you'll travel through 19 different towns, 21 routes, and even another 24 extra areas, such as forests, caves, temples, you name it, that all have custom soundtracks as well. So the world has a lot of content, and a main story that'll bring you all the way to level 70. Speaking of the main story, I'll admit that it's a bit disappointing. On your adventure, you'll come across both Team Lunar and Team Solar, who both despise each other while being an obstacle for the player. The antagonist groups did have some potential, but their climax was, in my opinion, pretty disappointing. Other than that, it's about the depth you'd expect from a Generation 3 or 4 Pokemon game. On to the new Pokemon. Yes, there are in fact 350 of them, and the game's Pokedex doesn't include any official ones. Visually, they look pretty good. Again, like most Fakemon games, you are going to find a small percentage of them to be unappealing. But what stood out to me was a lot of them kind of having a round complexion, and if you start to look at them for long enough, you'll start to know what I mean. However, for a free-to-play fan game, you can't expect an astronomical level of quality for a Pokedex that big. But at least on the gameplay side, they are fun to use, learning useful moves, and being spread out well enough to where you won't have to struggle to build a diverse team. But even if you do, I don't think it'll matter very much, because the game isn't very challenging. It has an approach to difficulty where enemies can hit pretty hard, but can be taken down just as easily with some super effective moves. Not to mention that the AI kinda sucks, so most fights can be won by just getting lucky. Overall, Solar Light and Lunar Dark is a game you'll probably enjoy if you're a casual player looking to play with completely new Pokemon. And despite the name, yes, it is just one game, but its main story is completely finished, with just an ounce of post-game content missing. I'll also include that it doesn't have the modern-day EXP all, so keep that in mind if you choose to play it. But at number 5 is a fan game that feels a lot different from the previous ones on this list. In fact, I think it might be the most unique one on the entire list. You won't begin your journey in a small town or recently arriving in the region. Instead, you're a live streamer, and one fateful night, while playing a strange new game, your power suddenly cuts out, and upon reawakening, you find yourself in a completely new world. This is Vinemon, a fan game inspired by the content creator Vinesauce. I will immediately say that as someone who's never watched him, there were definitely some references I was meant to understand and definitely didn't. But for the most part, the lack of that knowledge barely impacted my enjoyment of the game. Now, for this project in particular, I will start by reviewing the Fakemon designs. Most of them you can look at and call fan-made Pokemon, but some of them are pretty weird, and a few were definitely made as a joke. But this is a meme game, It's more of something to laugh at rather than something to take super seriously. But despite their funny looks, I could tell that they were all made with tons of thought and care, especially on the gameplay side. Every Vinemon was made to be viable in battle, even if it meant making a few of them pretty overpowered. But it just made the battles more fun, as I hate picking up a new Pokemon for my team only to find out it's pretty useless. As for the difficulty, it hits that sweet spot where the battles force you to think about your decisions, but you definitely won't find yourself stuck on a boss fight for multiple attempts. But what I enjoyed the most about Vinemon was its world. The land of Fanoff isn't your average Pokemon region. Every Pokemon Center has been replaced by a 1-up center, and nearly every town has a hub for a unique minigame or a place of interest that'll really blow you away with its uniqueness. Not to mention that every route just felt so alive and different from each other. Despite its unserious nature, Vinemon was put together with so much love, with beautifully sprited Fakemon, characters, and even tiles. Its main story is completed, so I highly recommend you give it a try if you're looking for something fun and humorous. But I will warn that it does contain a lot of vulgar language, so I wouldn't recommend it to younger audiences. After playing whatever fan game you take from this video, you'll probably be looking for more. Lucky for you, I upload a video every single week, covering ROM hacks with new forms, fan games with incredible stories, and much more. So make sure you subscribe to never miss any of them. So these next two games are kind of one and the same, and you'll see what I mean later on. But at number 4, we have Harsholm Island. It doesn't take you through your normal 8 gym, then Elite Four kind of story. Instead, you're an adult who doesn't really get out much. So after being invited to a small island by one of your father's friends, you're suddenly wrapped up in a conflict to repair the island's lighthouse, so ships can continue to safely return. Now, I know immediately that might not sound very interesting, but the plot and characters are still very charming. It hits that sweet spot where the little story that exists is very entertaining, but also barely gets in the way of your adventure. Which is great, because Harsholm Island has a much bigger focus on exploration. There are a ton of different side areas and branching paths, each with their own items and Pokemon to be discovered. Now, I will admit, the game will force you to do some of this exploring, where you would usually expect to do it on your own. However, that's not something I really minded, because, well, I was gonna do it anyways, but I still found it to be more rewarding than I expected. On to what you're all here for, the Pokemon. I think this game has some of the most unique Fakemon designs I've ever seen. As a non-artist, it's kind of hard for me to describe it. I feel like they don't look like Pokemon, but they're sprited in such a similar way and quality that the weird and outlandish designs hold up so well. I found most of them to be useful in my adventure, and the ones that weren't got some extra help from the variety of TMs you'll be able to find very early. And if it wasn't enough, yeah, they can all follow you at the same time. Even in its current state as a demo, I highly suggest trying Harsholm Island, but that's mostly because it's not exactly a game you download and play from your folders. No, this is an MMO, and Harsholm Island is just one of the Fakemon-filled regions you can find there. Before we dive more into it though, let's talk about one of those other regions. At number 3 is the region of Rika, which is part of the last game I just talked about at the number 4 spot. But don't worry, I'll go into more detail at the end of this segment about what that game exactly is. Rika is a beautiful region inspired by the real-world country of Costa Rica. To start, Rika has a very little focus on storytelling. You'll be handed a starter and some Pokeballs, then sent on your way. Where this game really shines is the exploration. The map is absolutely massive. There are over 15 different towns, 20 routes, and a ton of extra areas in between them. But many of them are completely optional, so you'll want to make sure you don't miss out on any of them. As for the new Pokemon, there are over 100 of them to capture. Some designs are admittedly a bit basic, but most of them are very cute and charming. I rarely found any to be useless in the early game, and once again, there was a good early TM variety to make up for the ones that were. As for the Pokemon battles, they're all done in the doubles format, and I'll admit the fights were certainly a bit harder than those in your average fan game, but it wasn't frustratingly hard, and felt much more like a fun challenge. The region of Rika has 3 out of 4 planned gyms available. It's incredibly fun, and I highly recommend it to anyone who's a fan of Fakemon and exploration. On to what games 3 and 4 really are. They're a part of an MMO called Pokegine, which is a hub for fan-made regions that are mostly filled with new Pokemon. If you want to learn more or how to play it, then check out my full video about it from last year, which I'll be leaving a link to in the description. Coming in at number 2 is yet another fan game you can't really make this kind of list without, and that's Pokemon Flux. Something that needs to be said about this game is just how much effort that's gone into every aspect of it. I've played a lot of fan games where the story is good, but the gameplay is kind of lackluster, or ones where the battles are fun, but the overworld is very bland. Of course, that's to be expected with free-to-play fan games, and I'm not trying to bash anyone whose game falls into that description. But Pokemon Flux somehow gets almost everything right. First of all, the world is really detailed. Every entity has its own shadow and lighting, to really immerse you in a world that almost feels three-dimensional. And rather than encountering a random Pokemon by spinning through the tall grass, you'll instead find them wandering about in the overworld. As for the story, it'll open with a cutscene showing off the championship battle, but after that, you'll receive one starter based on the character you choose, and another that's completely up to you. After that, you'll be tasked with traveling around the region and collecting 3 league emblems to participate in the championship league. While that might sound pretty basic, the characters all have charming personalities, and there are a ton of different conflicts and story arcs in between your main goals. So, a beautiful world and a fun story. But what about the new Pokemon? Yeah, they're really good. They're all well made with unique designs, and a few of them even have animated sprites. And on the gameplay side, barely any of them feel especially weak, and even the ones that do can still be made powerful using the new Flux mechanic. In battle, you can activate Flux moves, which are powerful attacks that either deal a ton of damage or boost your stats. Pokemon Flux is one of those games that really makes you forget you're playing something that was made for free, and I'm sure once it's finished, it'll be remembered for decades to come. But even right now, in its current state as a demo, I still highly suggest giving it a try, because even on my second playthrough, I'm still having a really fun time. And finally, we have my current favorite fan game with new Pokemon. At number 1 is Pokemon Harmonia. It's a game with, of course, a brand new region, a fun story, and over 100 new Pokemon. To start, you'll begin your adventure as an intern for a professor recently arriving in the region. On your journey, you'll be tasked with defeating 8 gym leaders in order to become stronger, and exploring the region's ancient history and Pokemon. But as you progress, you'll find yourself wrapped up in a conflict with a tech company that seemingly just wants to push their expensive products on the public. Yet they certainly have much deeper goals and secrets to uncover. The plot is represented very well, using tons of animations and very pretty pixel art. The story takes place in the region of Safar. It's a very unique region, starting the player in a desert where you'll work your way towards a snowy mountain and even into a rainforest. The routes and towns are very well mapped, with a lot of overworld animations and very well made tiles and structures. I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself, but yeah, the Pokemon are really well designed and very fun to use. There are even new regional forms and evolutions to capture as well. The difficulty felt pretty similar to a few other games on this list, where enemies can hit hard, but with a bit of strategy and super effective moves, they'll go down easily. Finally, there's a ton of quality of life features to make this a smooth sailing adventure. You'll get access to the EXP all with a bit of a twist. Rather than being able to turn it off, you can decide which members of your team receive shared EXP key. That way, you can balance your team's levels very easily. Additionally, in every Pokemon Center, you'll find a free mover learner, name raider, and a trainer you can battle an infinite number of times. Right now, I believe Pokemon Harmonia is the Fakemon fan game with the most amount of quality, while still having a decent amount of content at 6 gyms. So even if you're not a fan of unfinished games, you should definitely at the very least keep your eye on it. Alright, so I know there's probably going to be a lot of comments asking me where Pokemon Xenoverse is. And while I'm not particularly a fan of the game myself, I did want to give more of what I think is a bit of an objective take and say that I don't think it handles the new Pokemon side of the gameplay very well. Of course, they all look great, and the fully animated sprites are very impressive, so that's not exactly what I'm talking about. Not counting the additional forms, there are only around 70 new Pokemon, many of which are locked to the late or post game, and even a few of the ones that don't have their evolutions locked behind obnoxiously low RNG, or, again, the later post-game. The execution feels more akin to something like Pokemon Infinity, where, yeah, there are Fakemon, but the game focuses much more on alternate forms, and even canon Pokemon. Personally, I prefer to have a wide variety of Fakemon available, so I don't find myself playing with the same team as I did in a previous run, or the same one that many other players did for the first half of the game as well. But anyways, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'd like to also give a thank you to my channel members for supporting me on this journey. Be sure to subscribe and have a nice rest of your day.